Empaths who once felt emotionally lonely in childhood did not grow up in chaos, but in a form of emptiness that is difficult to name. It was not a lack of people, not a lack of physical care. It was the absence of something far more subtle, emotional presence that was stable enough for a young mind to lean on. When emotions arose without anyone to receive them, when questions formed without a place to rest, that child was forced to find another way to survive. And that way of surviving was neither calling out nor rebelling. It was turning inward. Very early on, the empath learned to observe instead of react, to register instead of express, to hold in rather than release, not because they were innately reserved, but because expression did not lead to connection. When emotions are not met, the mind begins to do the work meant for others, self-regulating, self-soothing, arranging inner experience in a way that can be endured. In the language of Carl Jung, this is the moment the ego begins to form without relying entirely on external mirroring. An inner container, an internal holding structure is built earlier than usual. The empath learns to stay with emotion without needing immediate reassurance. They become accustomed to the absence of validation, accustomed to empty space, accustomed to being their own witness. This is what creates a very different mode of functioning in adulthood. They do not assume someone will be there. They do not take care or attention for granted. They do not treat emotional presence as something stable. Instead, they observe rhythms, read consistency, and notice what is left unsaid. They develop an emotional intelligence based not on words, but on patterns, recurring structures. But the narcissist does not observe them through depth. They observe through a framework of power. Whoever reacts more matters. Whoever fluctuates strongly can be controlled. Whoever stays silent is weak. Whoever demands nothing is easy to manage. And it is here that a structural misjudgment appears. They look at this empath and conclude that the other person is easygoing, uncomplicated, low maintenance, even weaker than those before. Calmness is mistaken for dependence. Slowness is read as lack of awareness. Not reacting immediately is interpreted as fear or submission. The narcissist does not realize they are facing someone who does not operate on reflex, but on observation. And because the narcissist always measures strength by the intensity of reaction, a person who does not respond according to the familiar script is underestimated. This misjudgment causes the narcissist to invest in the wrong strategies. They use silence to create deprivation. But deprivation does not trigger panic. They use ambiguity to provoke insecurity. But insecurity does not spread. They withdraw to pull the other person back, but the other does not chase. From the narcissist's perspective, this looks like slowness or passivity, while in reality, it is a nervous system that is not guided by control games. From Carl Jung's perspective, this is the moment the persona begins to fall out of sync with reality. The narcissist's persona functions smoothly only when it receives feedback at the expected frequency. When feedback does not arrive or arrives on a different rhythm, they do not immediately recognize the danger. Instead, they believe they simply need to increase the dose, stronger, longer, more extreme. And the more they escalate, the more they unintentionally expose a truth they cannot face. Their power exists only when others react. Meanwhile, the empath does not perceive themselves as challenging anyone. They are simply continuing to operate according to an inner rhythm formed very early in life. They register shifts in energy, but do not rush to interpret them. They notice withdrawal, but do not assign catastrophic meaning. They allow signals to appear and wait to see whether the pattern repeats. This waiting, no arguing, no confrontation, no chasing, increasingly confuses the narcissist, because they can no longer determine their position within the other person's emotional system. At this level, the narcissist still believes they hold the advantage. In reality, they have already begun to lose the ability to read the other person. Familiar tools no longer produce predictable results. And when someone cannot be accurately read, they cannot be precisely controlled. This is a crucial transitional phase, because from this point forward, the relationship no longer operates on the old power structure, even though nothing appears to have collapsed on the surface. The narcissist has not yet panicked, the empath has not yet left, but the axis of control has begun to slip quietly, subtly, and irreversibly. The current begins to change direction at a very subtle point, not when the empath realizes they are being manipulated, but when their body no longer reacts according to the old rhythm. No more tightening when silence stretches on. No more restlessness when signals become ambiguous. No more need to clarify in order to soothe the inner state. What once triggered a cascade of reflexes now passes like a cold breeze noticed, then released. The narcissist senses this before the empath can name it, because their power has always depended on one thing: the ability to disturb another person's emotional system. In past relationships, the narcissist used withdrawal as leverage, a void designed to pull the other person into chasing, compensating, apologizing, explaining, repairing. But for an empath who experienced emotional loneliness, emptiness no longer takes the shape of threat. It resembles a familiar room, one they sat in for a long time as a child. Not pleasant, but not frightening. And when emptiness no longer hurts, the leverage disappears. Hoovering also begins to drift off course. Half-hearted attempts to return, sudden gestures, emotional bait that once worked so well now feel like flickering lights in fog. The empath sees them very clearly but is not drawn in. They do not react with hope, but with observation. Not because they distrust everything, but because their mind is trained to wait for patterns, not moments. The narcissist speaks a lot, but the empath watches whether behavior repeats. The narcissist makes promises, but the empath waits to see whether energy stabilizes. This difference throws the manipulation system off rhythm, like a melody played out of key within an orchestra. From Carl Jung's perspective, when the persona is no longer mirrored, the shadow rises with its full weight. The narcissist begins to feel a nameless restlessness. They speak, but leave no resonance, appear, but leave no trace, attempt to provoke, but receive no vibration. The empath does not argue, does not confront, does not expose. They withdraw energy naturally, like the tide receding from the shore without announcement. From the outside, the scene may look like coldness, but inside the empath, there is a quiet emotional discipline. They allow emotions to arise, but do not let them dictate behavior. They allow longing to pass, but do not use it as a compass. They notice regret, but do not build a home inside it. Each time this happens, an invisible thread loosens a little more, not by force, but by the absence of response. The narcissist becomes disoriented because there is no point of attachment. They try increasing intensity, longer silences, more dramatic appearances, more visible woundedness. But the empath no longer reads these signals as calls for connection. They read them as data. And the data reveals an uncomfortable truth. These movements are not about connection, but about restoring control. When that truth is seen clearly, the pull dissolves like mist under early sunlight. What renders the narcissist most powerless is not rejection, but no longer being prioritized within the empath's internal operating system, no longer standing at the center around which all decisions revolve. The empath begins to live according to their own rhythm, slow, steady, grounded. They choose silence not to punish, but to maintain balance. They choose distance not to cause pain, but to preserve clarity. And within that clarity, the entire power game becomes unnecessary. At this point, the danger fully reveals itself. No battle takes place, no victory or defeat. Only one operating truth remains. When a person no longer needs you to regulate their emotional world, you no longer have power over them. The narcissist experiences this as a slow freefall, silent, unseen, with nothing to grab onto. The empath is simply continuing a familiar path, standing firmly within their own space, where another person's power can no longer reach. The narcissist may have tried to replace you, someone new who reacts more easily, bonds more quickly, and is more easily triggered. On the surface, everything appears to keep functioning. But very soon, a sense of unease emerges, not because the new person is inferior, but because the old system no longer runs. They begin to realize that what they once had was not rooted in a specific person, but in an emotional function the empath silently carried. An empath who experienced emotional loneliness carries a distinctive operating system. They do not demand, do not require constant reassurance, and do not pull others into deep emotional presence. With them, the narcissist enjoyed a rare condition: being mirrored without being required to mature, being stabilized without having to take emotional responsibility. The replacement cannot provide this. The new person needs feedback to feel secure, needs words to trust, needs action to continue. Each of these needs forces the narcissist to give something they do not possess: genuine presence. And it is precisely this pressure that exposes the core void. Comparison begins quietly. Not a comparison of who is better, but of states. The state when with the empath: smooth, low friction, low demand, low fatigue. The state when with the new person: more reactions, more explanations, more tension. The narcissist cannot name this, so they mislabel it. The new one is too sensitive, too needy, too complicated. But the truth is that they are losing a function that once kept the persona upright. From Carl Jung's perspective, the persona survives through stable mirroring. When that mirroring disappears, the persona does not collapse immediately. It erodes. It erodes through each interaction that requires effort, through each moment of having to respond, through every instance where no one automatically absorbs tension on their behalf. This erosion creates a wordless obsession, not missing a person, but missing the conditions that once made existence easier. At this level, the narcissist may begin to turn back toward the old figure, not necessarily to return to the relationship, but to restore the lost function. Half-hearted approaches, ambiguous signals, memory cues appear as ways to test whether the old system still works. But the empath, at this point, no longer stands ready to carry that role. Not because they deliberately refuse, but because the role has ended. What renders the narcissist most powerless is the vague realization that no copy can reproduce that exact structure. Others may love them more, react more intensely, stay longer, but no one can both be there and not need them. And it was precisely that not needing which kept the system running. When this function disappears, obsession forms as a desperate attempt by the system to retrieve a lost component, while knowing it cannot generate that component internally. At this stage, the narcissist often experiences a quiet form of panic, not explosive rage, but prolonged instability. They replay memories, rewind old moments, trying to locate where control was lost. Yet every analysis leads to the same blind spot. The empath did not leave in resistance, but because participation was no longer necessary. And this is something the persona cannot process, because it exists only when others participate. The shadow begins to surface in many forms: emptiness, a sense of meaninglessness, objectless irritation, or a vague jealousy with no clear target. What is striking is that the empath does not need to do anything further for this process to unfold. No final declaration is required. No need to play the victim or the victor. Simply continuing to live within their own inner axis, the axis formed early when they learned how to be emotionally alone. That quiet stability becomes a reverse mirror, forcing the narcissist to confront their own emptiness. This is not a dramatic collapse. It resembles a bridge slowly losing tension, still standing, but no longer able to bear the old load. The narcissist senses this shift as an unease they cannot name, while the empath simply keeps moving forward without looking back. Not because they have won, but because they have exited the structure. And when a structure no longer has participants, it dissolves in its own way. There is a truth the narcissist realizes very late, often after trying every possible way to fill the void. You cannot be replaced in the way they believe. They can find another face, another voice, another body to place in the old position. But what they are searching for is not a person. It is an operating structure that once kept their persona intact, and that structure cannot be copied. Narcissists often confuse person with function. They believe that as long as someone new is willing to love, listen, or stay, everything will return to normal. But very quickly, a strange sensation appears. The rhythm is off. The new person reacts too much or demands too soon. The new person needs reassurance, needs commitment, needs validation. And those reactions, once thought to be controllable, expose the core difference. The new person does not carry the old operating system. An empath who experienced emotional loneliness does not maintain relationships through reflex. They do not need to be held constantly. They do not require frequent promises. They do not need reassurance to remain grounded. They self-regulate, self-contain, self-return. Because of this, when with them, the narcissist could operate the persona without pressure to give anything real. No need for deep presence. No need for emotional accountability. It was an ideal environment for the false self, quiet, stable, undemanding. The replacement is different. The replacement must react for the relationship to exist, must be answered, must be seen, must be assured. The persona grows weary, because this time it is not only mirrored, it is required to respond. The narcissist may label this too sensitive, too needy, or not like you. But beneath those labels lies a more uncomfortable truth. They are losing a function they once took for granted. And it is here that obsession forms quietly, invisibly. The narcissist does not miss you as an individual. They miss the state they had when they were with you, a state of not being pulled into emotion, not being demanded of, not being forced to mature. They miss how the system once flowed when you were there, how everything was held together without effort on their part. This is not romantic longing. It is functional longing. From Carl Jung's perspective, a persona that depends on external mirroring will always attempt to recreate the conditions that once allowed it to survive. But when those conditions no longer exist, and every copy fails, the shadow begins to whisper something the narcissist does not want to hear. The problem is not other people. The problem lies within their own structure. And because they cannot face this, they turn back toward the old figure, not to love again, but to restore the lost balance. The empath does not need to witness this process. They do not need to know they are irreplaceable. They simply continue living within their familiar inner axis, where another person's presence is a choice, not a requirement. Yet it is precisely this calm that traps the narcissist in an invisible search loop, moving from person to person, reaction to reaction, while the one thing they truly need is no longer available to participate. This is why this kind of empath cannot be replaced. Not because they are rare, but because they no longer play the role. When someone exits the role of operating the false self system, no one else can step in without paying a price. Obsession, in this case, is not residual love. It is the system searching for a lost component, fully aware that it cannot produce that component from within. But it would be a dangerous oversimplification to call this type of empath strong in a flawless sense. Their strength is not free. It was formed under conditions of insufficient support and therefore carries very real limitations, unpolished, uncomfortable, and impossible to mask with the language of healing. An empath who experienced emotional loneliness is not easy to love, not because they are cold, but because they do not love from need. They do not enter connection to be filled. They do not seek others to complete unfinished emotions. This makes them slow, very slow. They need time to observe whether presence is durable, consistent, capable of withstanding silence. For those accustomed to loving through intensity, this is easily mistaken for distance. They are also not easy to lean on. Relying on others is not a natural reflex for them. It is a conscious act, requiring repeated evidence over time. They can be close, they can care deeply, yet still maintain an axis of self-support. Not because they need no one, but because they learned very early that needing someone does not mean that person will stay. And so they do not rush to hand over the role of support to anyone. And they do not melt easily. Not because they lack emotion, but because their emotions do not need to be exposed, to be proven. They do not reveal themselves to create quick connection. They do not use vulnerability as a bridge. Their inner world is deep, but held privately. This can make others feel as though they cannot quite reach them, even though, in reality, the empath is very close, just in a less performative way. This kind of empath is not hungry for connection. They do not need someone to be there all the time in order to feel okay. What they long for, often silently, is genuine resonance. Not attention, not intensity, but the feeling of being met at the same level of awareness, being beside someone who neither asks them to shrink nor forces them to open completely. A form of closeness, calm enough not to trigger defenses and real enough to require no performance. Because of this, there is a clear price this type of empath pays. They open up more slowly than most, and when they do, it takes a great deal of time. They trust less easily, not because they distrust people, but because they trust patterns more than words. And they find co-regulation difficult, finding it hard to synchronize emotionally at speed because their nervous system is accustomed to self-regulation rather than regulating together with another. This makes them incompatible with relationships that require rapid fusion, constant reaction, or mutual dependency to feel intimate. They do not live in a we that dissolves boundaries. They live in two people standing side by side, each standing on their own. To those unfamiliar with this, it can feel disappointing. To those who need control, it is unbearable. For this reason, calling them dangerous is not about attack or manipulation. It is because they are not easily pulled into structures built on need, scarcity, and reflex. They are not perfect. They carry the marks of having had to stand alone too early. But it is precisely this imperfection that makes them impossible to use as an emotional regulation tool. And to a narcissist, or to anyone who needs another person to sustain their ego, that is a real threat, even if a very quiet one. At the deepest level, the threat this type of empath poses does not lie in behavior, but in something entirely invisible. They make the narcissist unnecessary. And that is the fear the narcissist never names correctly. The narcissist does not truly fear abandonment, nor do they truly fear being hated, judged, or condemned. All of those still give them a role, the victim, the misunderstood one, the center of the story. What they cannot tolerate is irrelevance, the moment they no longer serve any emotional function in another person's inner life. For an empath who once experienced emotional loneliness, this happens quite naturally. There is no dramatic decision to cut ties, no declaration of "I don't need you." The narcissist simply ceases gradually to be referenced in how the empath thinks, regulates, and returns to themselves. When tension arises, the empath does not think of them. When emotions surge, the empath does not seek them out to explain or soothe. When emptiness appears, the empath stays with it as they learned to do long ago in childhood. For the empath, this detachment is neither a moral stance nor a conscious defensive strategy. It is a natural reorganization of the nervous system. When you have lived through long stretches of emotional emptiness, you do not see emptiness as an enemy. You do not rush to fill it with words, actions, or another person's presence. You allow it to exist. And when emptiness is allowed to exist, many distorted structures begin to collapse on their own. For the narcissist, it is the opposite. Emptiness is not neutral, it is threatening. Not because they are lonely in the ordinary sense, but because emptiness forces them to face themselves. And that is something the persona cannot do. The persona knows only how to perform, react, and control image. When there is no one responding, the persona becomes disoriented, like an actor standing on an empty stage, still performing, but no longer knowing for whom. This is what makes the empath a paradox to the narcissist. They cannot fully hate them, because there was no direct harm. They cannot fully forget them, because the system once ran too smoothly when they were there. They cannot truly return, because the empath no longer stands ready to carry the old role. And so the narcissist remains suspended in an in-between state, not lost, not possessed, not replaceable. Over time, this is precisely what causes obsession to persist, not because feelings remain, but because a vital function has been removed from the system. The narcissist may remember your name, your face, or may not, but they always remember, without being able to name it, the feeling of when everything was easier, smoother, more stable, and they will continue searching for that feeling in others, while increasingly realizing that it does not come from other people, but from the structure you carried. The empath does not need to carry this awareness in order to go on living. In fact, many of them never name what they once provided for others. They simply know this: when they are no longer pulled into reaction, no longer adjusting themselves to keep the peace, no longer carrying another person's emotional weight, life becomes lighter in a very quiet way. Not because there is less pain, but because pain no longer spreads through the entire system. And here, the lesson is not only for empaths or narcissists. It is for anyone who has lived inside a structure where they carried what someone else refused to face. When you stop carrying it, you do not make anyone collapse. You simply return the process to its rightful owner. And if a structure cannot survive once you stop carrying it, then it was never a healthy structure to begin with. By the end of this journey, the questions that once churned relentlessly in your mind begin to fall away, not because they have been answered, but because they no longer hold power. You no longer need to know what the narcissist thinks, regrets, mourns, or how they continue to live. The questions that once kept you awake through the night now resemble empty seashells left on the shore, once filled with waves, now only the memory of sound. Because the farther you go, the more you realize this story was never truly about them. It has always been about what you carried on behalf of others throughout your life, quietly, unnamed, without acknowledgement. You carried emotions no one wanted to hold. You carried voids no one dared to look at. You carried other people's unformed parts, as if that were your natural responsibility. Not because you were weak, but because you learned how to stand steady in silence when you were very young. Some people grow up in calling voices. You grew up in emptiness, and that emptiness taught you how to hold yourself, soothe yourself, exist without needing confirmation. At first, it was survival instinct. Later, it became a role, the role of keeping things from collapsing, the role that allowed others to breathe more easily around you, while you gradually learned to hold your breath to keep the atmosphere stable. But nobody is born to hold its breath for an entire lifetime. And at some point, often in the second half of life, a strange kind of exhaustion appears. Not loud, not dramatic, just a very clear sense that you cannot continue living in this position anymore. Not because you resent anyone, but because you begin to feel absent from your own life. From the perspective of Carl Jung, this is when the process of individuation demands priority. No longer an ego living to adapt, to endure, to maintain external order. Instead, a slow, deep, and profoundly real movement begins, returning to your rightful place. No longer standing at the margins, no longer serving as background, no longer acting as a support beam for structures that would collapse without you. And when you withdraw from that position, what happens does not resemble a breakup. It resembles a room losing its support column. It does not collapse immediately, but it begins to tremble. Those who once relied on your quiet presence suddenly find the space unfamiliar, not because you did something to them, but because you are no longer doing what you once did. You no longer automatically hold things together, no longer automatically understand, no longer automatically regulate. This does not create victory. It creates silence. A silence without hatred, without accusation. A silence like the surface of a lake after the wind has passed, not because the water is gone, but because nothing is disturbing it anymore. And it is precisely this silence that disorients structures that survive on reaction, because they no longer know where they stand in your world. But what matters is this: you do not need to witness that disorientation. You do not need to stay to watch someone fall, nor wait for a belated recognition to feel that you are done. The most mature endings often have no witnesses. They occur when you stop turning back, when your life is no longer organized around analyzing others, but around resting within yourself. At this stage of life, freedom no longer looks like breaking out or expanding outward. It looks like returning inward, reclaiming energy that was scattered, reclaiming attention that was placed in the wrong places, reclaiming the right to be tired without explanation, reclaiming an inner life that you once shared too much, too early, too widely, not to close yourself off, but to open only where you are not required to trade yourself away. And if someone feels that you are colder, more distant, not like before, they may be right, but not in the way they think. You are not cold. You are simply no longer leaking, no longer pouring energy into places that cannot hold it, no longer standing in a position where others are stabilized by your self-distortion. If there is any danger in you now, it does not lie in strength, nor in awareness. It lies in the fact that you are no longer necessary to the structures that once lived off your quiet sacrifice. And to those structures, your silent freedom will always look like a threat, but that is no longer your concern. The remainder of your life does not need to be spent explaining the past. It can be used for living more slowly, more truthfully, more quietly, living without carrying, living without holding, living without serving as the backdrop for any disorder that does not belong to you. And if there is a true ending to this journey, it is not the moment someone loses you, but the moment you stop losing yourself.